Well, hello everybody. This video is about the Drax Biomass Power Station. It is an exercise in total stupidity, but I'm just going to explain just how much this is costing you, because they keep telling you the lie, and it is a lie, because either they're really stupid and don't understand it, or they're lying, that's the choice. That green energy is cheap. It isn't. It's extremely expensive. And so we're just looking at the biomass situation with Drax. Probably the biggest emitter of CO2 in Europe is our Drax power station. It supplies a stable power supply, which is the only feature that's good for it. So it's like coal and nuclear in that respect. Can't react fast, just like that. In fact, it was a coal power station, and they used to take the coal from a few miles away from a mine, short distance by train, and burn it. That was the history. But oh no, under this green madness, we changed it all to biomass. So where do the pellets come from? Well, you're going to find out. I'm going to take you back to Climate Realism episode 5, one of the first videos I made many years ago, well before I started putting them on YouTube. And this is a clip from that video about Drax Power Station, and it explains the background. After that clip, I'm going to explain just how many billions of pounds of your money is being sunk into this stupidity now behind this project. Drax Power Station is what we're going to feature here as the perfect example of the total irrationality of biomass. But first, let's start with the history of coal. All coal was laid down at one time, about 360 million years ago. When trees evolved, they created a new cell structure, so when they died and fell on the ground, there was nothing to eat them. And actually, the bugs and the microbes had a real hard job for 60 million years, so trees just kept piling one on top of another, forming the coal seams we know today. And in fact, that 60 million year period is the only time in the world that coal was formed. Because after that 60 million period, the bugs had wisened up to the whole situation and started eating the trees. So as they fell, they gradually decay and they would not be buried to form coal. We've had no new coal since then anywhere, so there's only one lot of seams. That was basically 60 million years of forest growth. And by the way, trees and vegetation on Earth was much grander then, because of course there are much higher levels of CO2, and so vegetation was abundant on a scale we have not seen ourselves. So what we used to do is burn coal for power. Coal equals old wood. But what biomass plants do, like Drax, is they burn new wood. So let's go through the logic of this. Unlike other forms of green energy, biomass plants are not intermittent. You know what power you're going to get when you need it. In effect, they replace coal plants. So what we are doing with biomass is burning new wood instead of old wood. So we have to chop down forests and supply some 37,000 tons of new wood every day. I am just stopping this clip to show you the size of these trains on the way to the Drax power station containing the pellets from America. There have to be a number of trains each day. This is just one of them, and it gives you an actual idea of the scale of this operation. Just consider how stupid this is. Here we are burning new wood instead of old wood, coal, just a few miles away, and transporting it across the world. The CO2 output from the new wood is actually greater than from coal, but it just adds to the stupidity. The whole of the UK is simply not capable of supplying anything like this figure. So, don't worry, we import it from mainly America, and now with some from Russia. So we cut down the trees that are absorbing CO2. Now, some of the Russian trees would take 150 years to grow back to where they were and start absorbing the CO2 at the same level. A lot of the American trees can be younger, anything between 20 and 40 years is typical, before you get to replace the CO2. So what you're doing now is taking a fuel, a modern fuel, and emitting CO2. And the amazing thing is, when you burn new wood, it gives off at least as much CO2 as burning coal, but probably more. 168,000 acres of woodland are at risk of being cut down just to supply one pellet facility in the USA, and that wood is headed for the UK. This facility is the UK's biggest emitter of CO2, burning more wood than any other facility in the world. And yet every day the UK taxpayers pour in 2.35 million to subsidise it. That's about $750 million a year. The alarmists claim it's CO2 neutral, but for a start it's putting out at least as much CO2, as coal. And of course big machines have to cut down those forests. People have to be moved into those forests. Offices have to be set up. The whole industry has to be there to take the forest away. You have to build roads. You have to create offices. You have to create canteens. You have to do the whole thing that you'd normally do when managing people. And that wood has to be transported then across a long distance to a pellet plant where it's made into pellets. And that pellet plant uses a lot of energy to do that, including heat to dry it. And then after the pellets are made, it has to be shipped by train to a port, again more CO2. And then it goes into a ship. And whether you know it or not, big ships use almost like a treacle type of diesel. They only use normal diesel to start the engines, but they actually run on very heavy treacle type diesel. And so then it has to come across the ocean to the east coast of the UK. Having done that trip with all its CO2 being emitted, it then goes on a train with more CO2, and then it eventually arrives at the Drax power station. Now all that CO2 is not being replaced, it's not being absorbed later on, because the whole principle is that you plant new trees so that in 30, 40, 100 years, whatever it may be, you're capturing the same amount of carbon as the trees that you cut down. But that's not really possible, because of all the other CO2 emissions I've just explained. Also, and assuming you do plant the forest, it can take 30, 40, even 100 years to replenish the CO2 capture of the forest you cut down. What about the climate emergency? Because in the meantime, you've dramatically increased CO2 when people are telling us we've got a climate emergency. The Welsh Government in the UK has declared a climate emergency over the next 10 or 12 years. So why are they substantially supporting the increase of CO2 during that period? It makes no sense at all. I'm sorry to say it, but our politicians are fools. Their green energy policies substantially increase the amount of CO2. And whilst that doesn't bother me, in fact I welcome it, it's an extremely expensive operation they're engaged with, which you, the taxpayer, are paying for. It is totally wasteful, doesn't achieve their objective, and doesn't make any sense at all. So the old way, you had the coal mine very near to the power station, you had a short train trip straight into the power station, and you only have to transport half the weight, because you get twice as much energy per kilogram out of coal than you do out of wood. Now, I'm not alone in my views on this. Here, 800 scientists from around the world petition the EU to stop biomass. In this report, UK scientists found that biomass was a complete disaster for climate change and wanted it brought to a halt. They claimed it could take up to 100 years just to get back to the position that you were in before you cut the trees down. And that's without counting all the other extra emissions. That's just counting the burning of the pellets. The penny is beginning to drop in some quarters. Michael Moore produced a film, Planet of the Humans, that demolished the green energy industry. And Michael Schellenberger has been an environmentalist all his life, but has now basically swapped sides. He's seen the light, heavily criticised the alarmist, and in his new book, Apocalypse Never, he's apologised for all the years of scare stories and alarmism. That is just not true. And at least some are getting some sense in Extinction Rebellion and leaving it to support nuclear power. Okay, so that clip gave you the background to Drax, a good background I think. I made it quite a few years ago and it gave you a good background to Drax. I put some little clips on it, by the way, to make current comments, those little blue boxes. Now, what's the situation now is it's even worse. Think about this. Drax have now said that really the idea is a bad idea, I suppose. They're burning pellets this way. What we need to do is capture the CO2. So instead of just burning coal originally, which would have been actually less CO2, and instead of doing all this work, bringing everything across the world and heating, making pellets and all this, instead of all of that, they've realised maybe the best thing to do is capture CO2. The government are about to announce a £2 billion subsidy for that, to capture the CO2 from Drax. Now, you could have done that to begin with if you wanted to, logically. If you're going to have coal doing it, why not capture it then? But this capture is pie in the sky stuff. It really is. But what I'm going to explain now is just how much £2 billion is. Let's make it real to you. So the question is, let's take a £10 note and let's take them stacked together tight like you get them in a wrapper from the bank. How high would they stack? How high would £2 billion worth of £10 notes stack? Would it be 100 metres? Would it be 300 metres? Well, here's the answer. No, we don't even measure it in hundreds of metres. We measure it in kilometres. So just how many kilometres high would this stack be? Well, here's the answer. That's right, 10 kilometres high of closely packed £10 notes. And who is going to spend this money for you? Well, it's our energy minister, the one who's in charge of energy security and net zero, totally contradictory terms inside our new ministry. Now, carbon capture has been tried in the United States, and it basically doesn't work. You basically expend more energy than you save. You know, it doesn't make sense. In other words, in capturing the CO2, you're going to emit more CO2. It's absolutely ridiculous. And don't tell me you can use wind for it, etc. That's nonsense. But that really deserves a separate video, and I will be doing one soon. Well, there we are, you know. So hold on. The original idea was to plant lots of trees to capture the CO2 back. But maybe they realised, they've realised the trees take a long time to grow. Not that this makes any difference to the world, by the way, because the world's carrying on with its CO2 increase on a massive scale. I'm just ignoring us. It all makes no difference at all, of course. Not at all. But could it get worse than this? Could it get worse than the $2 billion for Drax? You've guessed it. Yes, it can. And here's the next bit of news. You see, Drax has been receiving an annual subsidy ever since it changed over to pellets from coal. So just look at this. Energy Secretary Claire Coutinhow is expected to secure the scheme this week. She is due to commission a consultation into the best means to extend the subsidy system under which Drax received £617 million from consumer bills last year. It produced about 4% of the UK electricity. So this is an extra cost on top of what you're paying for the power from Drax. Gardner said, we plan to invest billions in developing 2 BECCS units at Drax Power Station, which would create up to 10,000 new jobs at the peak of construction. BECCS is the only credible large-scale technology that can generate secure, renewable power. So completely changed now from the trees, of course. But BECCS, I can promise you, which is the storage of carbon underground, carbon dioxide underground, is not viable. The energy used and the cost of doing it exceeds any possible benefit. Of course, there's zero benefit, because what they're doing is burying plant food. But now let's look at the cumulative effect of carrying on this subsidy. Well, as you can see here, Drax already has a subsidy for its wood burning until 2027. That's when the subsidy runs out. Recently, it's begun lobbying the British government for an extension for this subsidy. The UK's government's biomass strategy leaves the door open for subsidy until 2035, which would cost another £12.4 billion. That's on top of the £2 billion for the burying of the CO2, which, by the way, also has a big running cost to be added. So what are we up to now? Well, we're up to quite a lot of kilometres for that money. Now, I'm not one to applaud The Guardian as a newspaper of good information, but even a stop clock has to be right twice a day, and here they are quite right about this point. A call to cut the subsidies to Drax because their profits have nearly doubled. But there's another story, so it may get even worse than I've said so far. It's just a simple fact that governments can't do computer contracts, nor can things like the National Health Service or any other government departments. And they're pretty lousy, the government, at drawing up commercial contracts. I'm proud once that I sat on what was called a Water Resources Board, a national board for water resource planning, etc., who were doing a scheme. And they had a scheme that was going to take, it's cost £25,000 at the time in the 1970s to look into the feasibility of, and was going to take 2 years then and cost £250,000. And I did the job in 10 weeks, and I did it for £10,000 instead of the £275,000 they had planned and the 2-year plan. Well, that resulted in the committee being disbanded because there was no work left for it. So I'm quite happy am I disrupting back then in the 70s. But I'm mentioning that because the government did a contract with Drax. And I'm going to read this out so you'll understand just how bad that government contract is and the loophole they left open. Drax has denied a claim that it shut down production of one of the biomass generators to avoid returning money to the customers under the government-agreed contract. The power group slashed production at one of the biomass plants last winter, which was taxpayer-backed with revenue cap, and instead shifted the generation to the rest of its facilities to maximise profits amid record energy bills, according to the new report from Bloomberg. Now, what that means is, had they carried on with that plant, they would have made the excess profits that under the contract would have had to be repaid back to the government. That's us. There's no government money, it's us. But they didn't. A generator called Unit 1 at the company's massive power plant in Yorkshire, which burns wood pellets to provide energy, has received a £1.4 billion in green subsidies over the past 7 years, with the government aiming to reduce the UK's reliance on fossil fuels. That's a laugh, isn't it? Anyway, these subsidies contain consumer safeguards which stated if the electricity prices ever increased enough, that Unit 1 could comfortably make more money without the subsidy. Its earnings would be capped, requiring the company to send extra cash back to the energy supplier, who would then reduce what they charge customers. Huh? Civil servants are not the people to do commercial contracts, that's all I can say. I'm not even going to blame, Drax have denied all that, but I'm not even going to, well, I'm lost for words really, because they just can't do the job. The civil servants are useless. Government shouldn't be involved in business because all they're doing is wasting your money. The subsidies to green energy are absolutely enormous. We could have had energy bills, and I mean this, about a quarter of what they are today had we adopted the policies I've been advocating the last 10 years, which were fracking, get really cheap gas for us, and also nuclear. Right? And by the way, obviously continue with oil because we can't do without oil. Anyone who pretends otherwise is silly and childish. So there we are. There we are with Drax.